record. Okay. And let's line everything up. That. And line this up. Okay, perfect. So today I want to do our lecture on Bootstrap. So as I stated previously, I think in Discord, we're super lucky in the fact that Bootstrap version 5 just recently got launched into beta. So I spent a lot of time refactoring all the slides and looking at the API and whatnot so that we can learn the newest version of Bootstrap and kind of prepare for this for the new version to come out. So all of the documentation in these slides is going to be as per Bootstrap 5. So there's a couple of small changes from 4. If you use any documentation from 4, for the most part, it'll be similar. There's just small differences. And so with that said, it's going to be a relatively large PowerPoint slide because I want to make this as a reference document for you to use. So there's a lot of slides in here, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time delving into them after we discuss the concept, and that's so that you can use this as a resource later on to identify what some of these class names are. So over the course of today's lecture, we'll go over and talk a little bit about what Bootstrap is, how to import Bootstrap into our HTML document, how to go ahead and use Bootstrap syntax, and then all the various parts of Bootstrap, like defining a container and how we can do spacing and sizing, or how we can apply colors in Bootstrap, or how we can use Bootstrap to adjust our text or add icons, or to style tables and lists, to style images, buttons, and inputs, how we can use it for aligning the content of our HTML elements, either using a grid view or using Flexbox. And then we'll talk about some of the additional features, like using it to design nav bars, cards, or even image carousels. There we go. And so let's start with the beginning. What is Bootstrap? Bootstrap is simply a free front-end styling framework that makes it faster and easier to design web pages, to design web content. And so Bootstrap includes CSS based on design templates for typography, forms, buttons, tables, navigations, modals, pretty much anything that any HTML element we have has a predefined style for it inside of Bootstrap, so that we don't have to spend too much time creating CSS styles on our own. We just import Bootstrap. It has a lot of predefined styles, and we just apply it right into our HTML. So one of the big positive things about Bootstrap is that it allows, it gives us a tool to easily create websites that have responsive design. And so responsive web design just means that we aim to create websites that can automatically adjust themselves to look good on any type of device. So you have people who consume internet pages on phones, in which case you're holding them in your hand versus large desktops. So it becomes quite a challenge building a website that looks good for those two devices. In fact, that is the very thing Bootstrap solves for us. It solves that big problem of responsive views, where typically in a desktop or laptop, your browser is oriented in a landscape view where the width is greater than the height, whereas on something like a tablet or smartphone, your browser is in a portrait view where the height is greater than the width. And even in landscape views and portrait views, every device is going to vary across resolutions and screen dimensions. So it becomes quite a challenge on designing a interface that looks good on any type of device. And so by using Bootstrap, it solves that problem for us. Okay. So why use Bootstrap? Well, first of all, it's super easy to use. Anyone who has just a basic knowledge of HTML or CSS can start using it. It's super responsive. So when you use Bootstrap, you can be ensured that your web pages will display pretty nicely on any type of device. It used a mobile-first approach when it goes to render. So it looks nice on a smartphone, and then it looks good on a desktop or laptop as well, and it's supported by every browser. So there's very little reason not to use Bootstrap. So let's move on to how can we get Bootstrap into our HTML documents. Well, first you can either download it over at www.getbootstrap.com, or you can just link to it from wherever it's hosted through a CDN, content delivery network. Your first Bootstrap project will be the lab, and I'll include it in with the lab file. So you don't have to worry about going and navigating to the website to get that. You can just source it from the from lab 3. In terms of actually linking Bootstrap into an HTML document, it's super simple. In the head element of your HTML document, you link it just like you do a CSS file. In fact, it is a CSS file. That's all it is. I will say that Bootstrap has an additional dependency on JavaScript. So at the very bottom of your body, you should include a script tag that's going to link as a source to this JS file, this bundled JS file. And so you might wonder, well, why are we using JavaScript for a styling framework? And that's a very good question. You don't actually need to have the JavaScript portion of Bootstrap to work unless you're using one of these listed features. So Bootstrap will not have all of its functionality unless you also include the JS file if you want to use it for collapsible navigation bars. And that is a really cool feature. That's a feature we're going to want to use. We're going to use in the lab. And so for that reason, we're going to want to include the JS file to be able to get the collapsible behavior of navigation bars. Another cool feature we'll be using in the lab is to be able to build a carousel that allows you to toggle between images or essentially slides or whatnot, because it has controls built into it. Not built into the lab, but something that's also nice to be able to handle, which is a reason to include the JS file, would be support for styling checkboxes and radio buttons. Okay, so let's talk about the Bootstrap syntax. It actually doesn't really have much of a syntax. Bootstrap is just a collection of predefined CSS class selectors. So to use Bootstrap, all you're doing is you're setting some defined class name inside of your HTML element. So say, for instance, I wanted to use Bootstrap and I imported it, I linked it into my HTML document. Then all I have to do to actually apply it is inside of whatever element I want a particular type of style to be applied, I define a class and then use whatever the class selector is that's defined in Bootstrap. So if I wanted to create a container to hold HTML elements, I would create a div class that's just a generic block element in HTML, and I would give it a class name of container, which will give me some padding or some margins to the left and the right. And then I could put a button in there, and then I could render my button to have a very pretty aesthetic, and then I can make it a large button, and I can give it like a blue color. So I'm applying 3 different class names there to apply 3 different styles. And that's it. And then I'll have something that's responsive and looks nice, and I did not have to touch a inkling of actual CSS because it's all defined for me. And one powerful thing about Bootstrap is almost every CSS property has a predefined class selector inside Bootstrap. So the reason why these slides are so big is because we're going to cover a lot of them, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining it because we already covered a lot of these properties in the previous lecture for CSS. Just so you have access to this, there's a great collection of resources for all the class names available in Bootstrap right here at this link. So you can either go to the official page where the documentation is held at, or you can go to this kind of collection here. I'll show you, that has a collection of all the different class names, and then they give a small depiction of how that class actually how that class name renders into the HTML here, and then a descriptor, and then the type of element it's used on. So this is just an awesome kind of dictionary of every possible term that you can scour through and familiarize yourself with. So that'll be included right there. So let's start talking about all the different components that we have available in Bootstrap. Well, the most primitive component we should talk about is Bootstrap Containers. So the idea behind a container is all of your HTML elements should be defined inside some div element that has a class called either container or container fluid. A container essentially just creates this responsive container to hold your HTML elements that puts some fixed margin on the left and the right, so that you have you kind of have some nice spacing for all of your content. Now, if you want your if you want your HTML elements to consume the full width of your container, then you can use container-fluid instead. So the difference between container and container fluid is just how much spacing is going to be to the left and the right of all your HTML content. And as the viewport adjusts in real time, it'll go ahead and reevaluate and refit all of your HTML elements within that. So since we're already kind of talking about spacing and sizing of our HTML elements using Bootstrap, starting with containers, let's talk about how we can actually apply spacing and sizing properties, how we can style those using Bootstrap instead of having to manually do that through CSS. So if I use a class selector of W-25 or W-whatever one of these four numbers are, then I can affect the width property of that HTML element. So a width-25 will have that element consume 25% of the space available. So it allows you to shrink it. Width-50 would be 50% of the space of the as defined by the parent element. Width-75 and width or W-100. So it's W- and then your options are 25, 50, 75, or 100, depending on how much space you want to consume it. A good visualization of that is right here. And very similar, just like we have that with the width, we could do the same thing to go ahead and easily specify our height. So we can have an element consume 25% of the available height, 50%, 75%, or 100% of the height. Simply with the H-25, H-50, H-75, and H-100. We also have an auto option. That's the default option. You don't really have to worry about adding that. You only want to add either the width or the height if it's something that you want to apply a height or width property to. And then just like on the CSS lab, if you have an image that's too big and you want to set the max width or the max height property, that's MH-100 for the max height, or MW-100 to set the max width. So all these properties, just like we saw in CSS, can be set using Bootstrap, applying the class name, and then you don't have to create any CSS file on your own. Other space and sizing properties is we could do our width and height based off of the viewport as opposed to what the parent element is. So you can force an element to take up 100% of the viewport height or width by appending a V on top of that. So VW-100 and VH-100 will affect the width and the height, but based on the viewport size as opposed to the parent size. You can also set the min width and the min height of an element in a very similar way. And again, the min would be based off of the viewport's width and height. Okay, so since we're on spacing and sizing, previously we talked about the box model that HTML elements have, where you have the HTML content, and then around the content itself is a padding, some spacing that we call the padding, and then you have a border that can go around the HTML element, and then outside the border is the margin. So we can either apply a margin or a padding, and really the only distinction between those two is whether it's inside the border or outside the border of an HTML element. So if we want to go ahead and provide a margin or padding value to our HTML element, we would just use M dash and then some number between 1 to 5. So examples of how this would actually look in our code would be right here. And so M-1 would be just a small margin. M-5 would be a much larger margin. And so we can also do MT to just apply a margin to the top. We could do MB to apply a margin to the bottom. We can we can define mx, which applies a margin on the x-axis, so to the left and the right, or we could do my dash some number to apply a margin on the y-axis, so a margin on the top and the bottom. And you can mix and match these. So you could do like an MT2, MB3 if you wanted to, and have a top margin that is a different size than a bottom margin. And so just like we have the ability to just provide this class name to affect an element's margin value, we can also go ahead and do the same thing for padding. And so here it would just be P dash and some number between 1 to 5, and where 1 is the smallest amount of padding that you might want to apply on the element where no padding is given at P dash. So you want to, no class selector defined would be a padding of 0. So to apply a small amount of padding would be P dash 1, all the way to a maximum amount of padding, which would be P dash 5. And so just using P by itself applies padding equally on all sides of the element, but you can also just specify PT for a padding on the top, PB for a padding on the bottom, PX for a padding to the left and the right, or PY for padding on the top and the bottom. And then we also have similar controls to be able to define our borders. So we can just apply a border using the class label border, or we can have a border that's just defined on the bottom, just on the top, just on the left would be border dash start, or border dash n would be a border just on the right of our HTML element. Now with borders, we could do tons of things. We could apply colors to the borders as well. And so the first thing you're going to say here is that the colors that are predefined in Bootstrap are what are called context names. So they don't use the terms like red and green and blue and black. They give names that apply to kind of like an action. So here, and this is going to be something that you're going to see for the rest of this document, and you'll get very used to as you start using Bootstrap more and more. Border dash muted will produce a gray border. Border dash primary is going to create a blue border. Border dash success will produce a green border. Border dash info is going to produce a blue-green border or a light blue border. Border dash warning will produce a yellow border. Border dash danger would produce a red border. Border dash secondary also produces a gray border that will look exactly the same as the muted border. Border dash white would produce a white border, and border dash dark would produce a black border. So using the border dash any one of the color names used in Bootstrap will produce that color. So since we're kind of talking about color, let's move on to talk about Bootstrap colors. If you want to color, so we saw that you do border dash and then one of these context colors names to produce a colored border. We could do the same thing for our text. And it's the same name. So if I want that gray colored text, I do text dash muted. If I want blue text, I do text dash primary. If I want green text inside of that HTML element, I just have the class name text dash success. And it's the same with the blue green. That's going to be info. Warning is the yellow. Danger is the red. This secondary is gray. And dark gray is going to be text dash dark. And then you could also do text dash white if you have some other non-white background you want to draw a lighter text onto. And just like we can color the text using these colored names, these context names, we can do backgrounds as well. So like BG dash any one of those same names, primary, success, info, warning, danger, secondary, dark or light, will produce a background color on that element. And so this is how we can very easily apply colors into our HTML document or on our elements. Okay, let's move on to how can we use Bootstrap to go ahead and style our text and icons. Let's start with our heading fonts. First of all, just by importing Bootstrap, we get a different default font, something that's a little bit cleaner and crisper than your typical font that's inside the browser. If I want to have a heading that stands out more, I can apply one of the class names of display dash some number. Display dash 1 gives me the biggest of the display fonts that's built into Bootstrap, whereas display-4 would give me the smallest. And so if you want something that looks different, if you want something that is the like a secondary font available to you in Bootstrap to really highlight like important section changes or tops of pages, you can use this as a class selector and really distinguish it so. Now, Bootstrap also allows you to adjust a lot of the font weights and font styles by default without having to add any of your own CSS code. So if you give some piece of text the class label of FW is short for font weight, FW-bold, it will bold that particular text. FW-bolder makes it even bolder. FST, short for font style, -italic will italicize that text. You could also make the font weight light or lighter, or you can even have a alternate font that will make a smaller piece of text or a paragraph stand out by just giving it the class name lead, L-E-A-D. Or you can give a class name of small to a piece of your text and go ahead and shrink that font size by 80% of the parent to make it a little bit smaller. So again, you can adjust all these font properties just by using these class names after you import your Bootstrap CSS file. You also have access to be able to align your text. So you could do text-left, text-center, text-right, and text-justify to left align, center, right align, or justify the text. And then text transforms are also available. Probably the biggest one that you'd want to be aware of is the ability to remove the underlines on anchor tags. So applying the class name text-decoration-none will remove the default stylings on a hyperlink. Okay, so we talked a lot about Bootstrap text, how we can modify the font weights, the font styles, and how we can modify some of these transforms. Let's also talk about one of the more exciting things that we get from Bootstrap is icons. So we can actually render a huge collection of icons. Bootstrap has made available an icon library with over 1,200 icons that you can use for whatever project for free. And for a full listing of it can be found right here, which I'll give you this PowerPoint slides after this lecture so you can browse. But just as an example, suppose you wanted to go ahead and have like a house icon that rendered inside your navigation bar. Then to do that, you just create an I element. We'll create like an icon element and give it a class name of BI. So BI is short for Bootstrap icon. And then after that, we give it a second class name of BI dash whatever the particular unique label is for that icon. So this particular one would be BI dash house. And so the wonderful thing about this is since this is actually icon is rendered similar to a web font, you can do every kind of font style or font weight or font size to that icon and to make it very large, very small, and it's a vector image, so it won't get pixelated. So these are great for menus. Okay, I want to move on to tables and lists. If I want a much nicer looking table, I would just go into my table element and give it the class table, and I get this. If I want a table that has striped rows, I do table-striped, and I get this. If I want a borderless table, I just do table-borderless, and I get something like this. If I want tables that have different colors, after I declare I want a table, I can give it a second class name of table-primary, or success, or danger, or info, or warning, or active, or whatever any of the number of colors that we want to apply. So we have blue tables in green and red and blue-green and yellow and gray, and this usually renders darker than what's being displayed there for dark. For table headings, I can go into the table head, and apply either namethead-dark to get a dark header or thead-light to get a gray header. So it's distinguished from the actual rows. So predefined styles for table headers versus just the row colors. I also have properties or these class names that can change the size of the table to make them either small, medium, large, or extra large. Don't really care too much about that. This is just for your reference later on as you're building projects out. Don't want to spend too much time just looking at a lot of class names. Okay, let's move on to lists. So our basic, we can have a basic list as you would normally see it defined in HTML. So we have a unordered list with some list items here. So if I give my unordered list a class name of list group, and then each of my list items, list group item, I can get this much nicer looking styling for my list inside of Bootstrap. Now, suppose I wanted a horizontal list instead of a vertical list. Super easy, I can do that. I just go ahead and also add the list-group-horizontal class name to my list element, and I'll have a horizontal list item. So you can see it becomes incredibly easy to get responsive styles for your HTML. If I want to have items where the background color is different for each list item, I have list group item colors, which uses the context color names that Bootstrap supports. So success is green, secondary is gray, info is blue-green, warning is yellow, danger is red, primary is blue, and dark is going to be a dark gray. You also have light, which is a light gray. And that's just going to be list group item, the same thing that the class name typically is for a list item, but also followed by the color. So if I want it to be a list group item, I need to use that as a class name. And then if I want to use a specific color, I use the list group item and then whatever the color name is after that. Okay, let's move away from text and the data structures that kind of hold text and move on to images. One of the most powerful things about Bootstrap is, again, its responsiveness. One of the things that has to be responsive inside of our content is going to be the images. So if we want an image that might be too big for our viewport or too small, we can just apply a class label of image or img-fluid, and it'll apply this style to it. It'll ensure that the max width is set to 100% to fill the space and that the height is set to auto. And this way, no matter what the viewport is, it'll ensure that your image properly fits inside of your within the browser, and it'll scale up and down as need be. So every time you add an image, just add the class name img-fluid, and it should go ahead and make a responsive image. In addition to that, Bootstrap has predefined a number of different shapes that you can apply on top of your image. So if you do a class name of rounded, it'll give you these rounded corners. If you do a class name of rounded-circle, it'll give you this, it'll render your image as a circle. And if you do a class selector of img-thumbnail, it'll go ahead and render your image smaller and with a white border around it, kind of like it's a postcard. So these are all different shapes you can apply to your image beyond just giving it a responsiveness. So again, when you get to what will eventually be the third homework, which will be the Bootstrap, you can have fun playing around with these different class selectors. Okay, let's move on to buttons and inputs. So these are how Bootstrap would render all of our buttons. So whenever we create a button element, we can give it a class of just BTN. And whenever you have any button, it should always use the BTN class selector so that it renders it to have these nice rounded corners. Now, on top of that, we can have our buttons display in whatever colors we want, and we apply the context name color that we get through Bootstrap. So this is just BTN, this is BTN, and then the color BTN-primary. So this is rendered as a button, and then it's displayed in blue. And then we have secondary, which is gray, BTN success, which is green, BTN info, which is like a blue-green, BTN warning, which is a yellow, BTN danger, which is a red, BTN dark, which is a black, and BTN light, which is a white. So easy and very pretty looking buttons. They use a more flat approach. So let's suppose you don't want solid colored buttons though. Suppose you want buttons that just have an outline and have a transparent inside. So if you draw these buttons on top of a background image or on a video, you want to have not obfuscate the image, then you can go ahead and create an outline of a button. And when you hover over it, it then fills it in. So to get the outline, it looks very similar to what we're doing with the color, but you just add the word outline in between BTN and the color. So it's BTN-outline primary, outline secondary, outline success, outline info, outline warning, outline danger, outline dark, and outline light. We can also change the size of our button. So we could do BTN-LG to make a button large, right? Or we could do BTN-SM and make a button small. And this would be, just for comparison's sake, the default size of the button. So you could do large or small depending on how you're arranging your elements. We can even take a group of buttons and collect them into a button group. So suppose I have 3 buttons defined here. I can contain them within a div tag, a div element, and then give that div element the class btn-group, and then they groups them together and treats them as a singular thing. And so this ends up looking really nice if I go ahead and actually apply a different color to each one of these buttons. So that's just one option to be able to start grouping collections of HTML elements or inputs together. Okay, we talked everything we could pretty much about buttons. So let's talk about the other types of inputs we might want to be able to apply styles to, especially responsive styles. Our text inputs, which Bootstrap supports all the HTML5 input types, would be defined as so. The actual input element, we would give the class name form control, and that produces a responsive input field. Now, if I want my input field to be collected with its label, I would create a div tag to contain both the label and the input element. So this div holds these two, and then I give it the class name form group. And so that form group will make a responsive style for both the label and the input. So the input itself is given a form control name, and then the collection of both the label and the input would be given a form group. And then I can create two of those. I can do multiple of those. So this form group represents the name input. This form group represents the password input. So just like you would see with text inputs, we can also apply a similar style to our checkbox inputs and our radio inputs. And so instead of what we used here, which was form group and form control, the words we would use here is form check input and form check as our class names for the div that contains the input and the label, and also the checkbox input object would be, or input element would be form check input. And it's the same for radio. So if the type is radio or the type is checkbox, we use those same class names to get a styling that would be similar to this. And what's great about this is we can even, using Bootstrap, get horizontal styling. We get inline checkbox and radios by just using the keyword here. Instead of using form check inside of this div that holds the label and the input, we can use form check inline, and then it gives us a horizontal checkbox or a horizontal radio input. Select inputs uses the same class name that text input would use. So it would be form control for the actual select item, and it would be form group for the div that contains the select item and the label. And if we want to change the size of our inputs, we can do what we've done for other things we've changed the size for. We use what the class name typically is, form-control, and then -sm if we wanted to render small, or -lg, form-control-lg if we want to render it large. And then we also have input groups. What an input group is, it allows us to take the label or a button or some other element and actually embed it alongside the input field. So here's an example where some text, the @ is embedded in front of the field for username. And here's an example where this text @example.com is embedded after the input field for what looks like an email address. And this is pretty simple to do. When you define your input, you give it the class name form control. Then you can create this div that's going to be the label that's going to be part of the input group prepend. And so that will prepend it, or it could be append, which would append it to the end. So either put it at the beginning or the end. And so in between that div is going to be whatever the text is that's going to get rendered inside of the input, but not be a part of the input. And then that entire thing goes into a div that's called an input group, whether you want to append it or prepend it. Again, this you might not necessarily use, but you have access to it in case it's you're doing some design work and you need to reduce the space of your labels. This is a good way to conserve space, to actually have your label consume part of the input space. And just like what you saw with the input resizing, we can create small input groups or large input groups. Very similar to what we did before, just input-group-sm for small or input-group-lg for large. Okay, so I pretty much just flew through 46 slides in about 38 minutes. So let me just take a small pause and ask, is there any questions up to this point, or does this seem pretty straightforward? I mean, there's nothing deep. I want to say that there's probably nothing deep here. Most of the concepts we've covered here, we've already talked about in CSS. All we're doing here is applying it by using class names. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Once you import the Bootstrap CSS file, the hardest part about learning Bootstrap is the vast collection of class names. Okay, so I want to move on to some of the more interesting elements of Bootstrap. So everything we've seen up to this point is just being able to change the spacing, the sizes, the colors, the font styles, the font weights, the default stylings for tables and lists and images and buttons and inputs. Let's talk about aligning elements, because when we talk about what it means to have a responsive design to our website, it's all about how the items get reorganized and displayed depending on if your viewport is narrow or whether it's wide, whether it's portrait mode or whether it's landscape mode, whether it's viewed on a tiny little smartphone or if it's being displayed on a 60-inch monitor. Okay, so here I want to introduce the notion of the Bootstrap Grid. And this, to me, is where a lot of the magic of Bootstrap occurs. So a Bootstrap Grid is defined by a div that would be a row, and inside that div can be any number of columns. So the Bootstrap's grid system is built on top of CSS Flexbox, and it allows up to 12 separate columns on one page. So one row can contain 12 individual columns, or it can contain less elements that is then divided across a 12 units. So for instance, I could have 3 elements that consume 4 columns of space. I could have 2 elements where one consumes 4 columns of space and the other consumes 8 columns of space. I can have 2 that where both consume 6 columns of space. I could have 1 element that consumes all 12 columns of space. I could have 1 that consumes 3 columns of space and 9 columns of space on the other. So the idea is you have up to 12 units you can partition between elements. So you can have a maximum number of 12 elements. You could have a minimal of 1 unit, or any number between allocated with as much space as you want. So let's actually delve into this a little bit more. So you have a number of different columns. If you just do column dash whatever, that's defining the column size for everything. So that's going to be the column definition for essentially the smallest possible view, which would be on a smartphone. And then column dash small would be a breakpoint. So you can set a different breakpoint for a small viewport as opposed to just column dash whatever it is, whatever the default is. column dash medium, column dash large, and column dash extra large. So actually, I have this table I want to kind of use to give you an example of this. So here, this would be horizontal at all times. It has, it would be suitable for portrait phones. This would be your kind of default setting. It can support up to 12 columns. Column dash small would be suitable for like phones in landscape mode. It collapses to start a horizontal above the breakpoint. So if the viewport is above 576 pixels, then it will display with whatever is after that. So let's say we do column dash SM dash 4, where we want to have 4 elements on the column, or 4 items across a column, or it takes up 4 units of space. If it has enough viewport width to support that, then it'll render it. If it's smaller than that, then it creates a natural breakpoint and it'll render below that. And I'll show you a depiction of this. And so the idea behind column dash a number, column dash SM dash a number, column dash MD medium dash a number, column dash LG large a number, column dash XL dash a number is going to be depending on how wide can your viewport be before it collapses and the space creates a breakpoint and just starts rendering the elements in this inside this row vertically as opposed to horizontally. So that's the powerful thing about the grid, is that it'll dynamically decide whether to go and render items horizontal or vertical. So let's actually look at the structure of this. I have a div class where I define a row, and then I have a nested collection of classes that have some kind of column attribute dash, and then it could be whatever numbers that are that add up to 12. So it could be 6 and 6, or 4 and 8, or 2 and 10, or whatever. So this is the basic way. And then I can create another row that would go under that, and maybe it has 3 columns. And then I create another row, it has 3 columns. And so this allows me to have a grid pattern to my website that has really nice flexible breakpoints. So an example of this would be a row with 2 columns, would display like this. This would be a row that has 4 columns defined in it that would then display this. Notice they both take up the same amount of viewport, and it nicely and responsively goes ahead and renders them as such. Another nice thing about the grid structure is that it ensures that every column within inside of a row has an equal height. So if one column is taller than the others, it will go ahead and ensure that the column parent all matches up, so that rows that are underneath this will line up across their row as well. So just a nice little property of the Bootstrap grid. So let's take a look at some practical examples. So if I have this div class row with these divs inside, all with columns without specifying a size, it'll automatically and determine the 3 elements. So it's going to probably give 4 units, 4 units, and 4 units to each of those columns. Suppose we wanted to go ahead and have a responsive column. We talked about this before. And so I go ahead and create a row that has column dash SM. So that's my breakpoint. So if it gets smaller than like 576 pixel on the width side, then it will collapse from being a row with 4 columns to where the row is displayed vertically, just like so. And so this is what we mean by a breakpoint, is that when your viewport gets too narrow to properly support 4 columns of space, it will instead reorient this data so that it's one on top of the other, so that it looks nicer on a smartphone versus looking nicer in a landscape mode. Here's an example of how we can have inside of our code where we can define 2 columns of unequal size. So I create my row, and then the nested divs are going to have a column -4 and a column -8. So 4 units and 8 units would render just like that. If I wanted to give my columns different backgrounds, I can do that the same way we learned about how to apply colors, background colors. So here I would have my row, and then I would set and create a column of 6 units, and then I give it a background of success. So everything inside this column will have a background of green, and then I can have a separate column that I give a different background color. And since it's an autonomous column, it can have its own background color. So we can start matching what we learned before, some of those class names we learned before, on these grid structures. We can even have nested columns. So I can have a row that is 8 units large here, and then 4 units large here. So I have a row that has a column of 8 and a column of 4. Inside my column of 4, I'll have col-4. That's where we're getting the text here. Inside of my column of 8 units here, I could put this text. Yep, it renders right there. But then I can create a new row that exists inside that column that itself would be 12 units large this way across. And so inside this nested row, I can create columns. Let's say I create 2 columns, each of equal size of 6. So it's -6 and -6. You'll see it then renders here. So again, super powerful way. Imagine if this was used to design a website. Column 4 might be my menu options that appear on the right-hand side. And then I might have 2 columns of space where maybe this is a collection of images and this is a collection of text. Or this is blog post or hyperlinks, and this might be project hyperlinks. So you could start to see, once you start identifying the layout of your website, you can start mapping them to grids and nested grids. And then it's important to also state that you can mix the breakpoints. So depending on the size of the display, you can have, let's say, breakpoint where if it's going to be a small viewport, you want to have this column should be 9 units across. But if it's medium, because maybe it's an image, so you don't want it to consume too much of the vertical space, you can make it 6 units across. But if it's large, then you expand it again to be 8 units across. I should also note that you can also use the number 0 when defining the size of a column or a breakpoint for a column. And so if you do apply the value of 0, it does not display that column at all when that breakpoint occurs. So one of the nice things about mixing these breakpoints, and you'll see this in the lab, is that we have an image on like the About Us portion of the lab that will only display if your viewport's large, but then it gives it the column size of 0 as you define a breakpoint so that it narrows in and becomes smaller, so that that image doesn't display on a mobile phone. It only displays in a landscape mode. So yeah, you can mix and match these, and this might be difficult to understand what's happening until you actually implement this and witness it in the browser, where you can pull where you can manually adjust the viewport size by just taking the corner here and making it small and large and whatnot, and see how the breakpoints can affect how the elements are laid out internally inside of the viewport. And why you might want to have, a lot of times, the reason why you want to have multiple breakpoints like this is for image elements, so that it doesn't scale too big or too small before it just collapses to be one on top of the other, or it consumes all of your height space. Okay, so some general rules about our about grids is that the rows must be placed within a container or a container fluid. And moving forward, the first thing you should start doing when you start defining your HTML content is putting all your content into a container, into a div container for Bootstrap. And so rows have to be in that div container so that you get the proper alignment and padding. So use rows to create a horizontal group of columns, and then the content should be placed within the columns itself, and only columns should be the immediate children of rows. So you have a div for rows, and then inside of there should be your divs for columns, and then inside the divs of columns would be the actual pictures or images or paragraphs or heading elements, whatever else you're actually defining. You can use predefined classes like row or col-sm-4 to quickly make grid layouts. Makes it way easier than fiddling around with CSS. And the big thing here is also keep in mind that you always have 12 available columns. You don't need to use that many, but understand that if you're trying to, everything's based off of a ratio of it being 12 columns large. And so the column widths are in percentages, so they can be fluid and size relative to the parent element. And by parent element, it means, let me go back to here, like this row here is a child of this other column, so it can only render up to here to here and to the width of the column that it's contained within. Whereas the outer row is in the parent element of, let's say, body or the container, so it can consume more space. And so when I say 6 units by 6 units, since it's half of 12, it's going to take up half of the available space here, half the available space here, versus 8 and 4. The big takeaway is just remember it's always 12 units. Use that to compute how much space a column should be relative to the parent space that you're allotted. Okay, so I want to talk about using flexboxes now. So you'll probably almost always use grids to arrange your content, but there are sometimes the cases where you want to arrange things using a Flexbox container. So to create a Flexbox container using Bootstrap, you just use the class d-flex. So if I create a div here, give it the class name d-flex, and then all the items inside of there will automatically be converted into flex items, and it'll go ahead and notice these are div class. These are all div elements, so those are typically block level elements. But since I put them into a Flexbox, the entire point of a Flexbox is to be able to flexibly grow my elements out, and the default behavior is to grow them out in column order as opposed to row order, so it grows them out horizontally. So it places one after the other after the other, just like what we learned with CSS. So in addition to a Flexbox container, I can also define an inline Flexbox container using the keyword d-inline-flex as opposed to d-flex. And here I just grabbed this image to illustrate what the difference between a flex container and a flex inline container is. And it's just as your flex container items start to wrap around, the natural default is to go ahead and stack them vertically, but with a d-inline flex, it would stack them horizontally. I don't know if you'll ever need to use a d-inline flex. I'll be honest, I don't know if I've ever actually used this particular class name, but it's just good to know what the property difference is between these two. Then flexboxes can grow in certain directions. So if you have your flex row, it would grow from left to right. If you do flex-row.reverse, it would grow from right to left, where the first element would be the rightmost, and then the latest element would be the leftmost. And so to see how that works is just look in the class name, we would put what the order is. Excuse me. So after we label our Flexbox container, we would then give it that property, whether we want it to be flex-row to go from left to right, or if we want to do flex-row-reverse to do right to left. We also have the option to do a vertical direction. So as opposed to doing flex rows, we could do flex columns. And if you do flex columns, the default behavior is to instead flex out the items from up to down. If we do flex-column-reverse, we would do it from bottom to up, from down to up. We also can just justify the content. And so we can justify the content of our flex items in a number of ways. We can justify the content from the start, which means that it would go from left. It would start at the left. If we justify the content at the end, it starts at the right-hand side. Now notice this is different than what we saw before. The items are in the order that they're placed. So it would be flex item 1, 2, and 3, but the entire group of items are justified towards the right-hand side versus the left-hand side. So I just want to highlight that before flex item 1 was at the leftmost. Here, the ordering is remained. It's just all the group of items are correlated towards the end. We can also do justify content to the center. We can do content between, where it maximizes the space between each flex item that's put into the flex container, or we can justify the content around, where it tries to minimize the space. It centers but minimizes the space between these items that are put into the Flexbox. We have the ability for each Flex item to fill its entire width. So we could just do flex-fill and inside the actual item itself. So if we have a Flex container, now we can start applying properties to the items themselves. So up till now, we've been modifying the actual Flexbox container with all these attributes. But notice the actual items can be giving flex fill, and that actually will have them consume their entire horizontal space. Or we can just take one item and tell it to flex-grow-1, and it will consume all the space that the other ones do not. So if I have flex item 1, which is its normal size, flex item 2 is its normal size, flex item 3 will be whatever space is left over here. So you can grow out a unit if necessary. We can also change the order. Notice the order here that's being rendered is flex item 3, flex item 2, and flex item 1. The order in which they're actually declared in the HTML is flex item 1, flex item 2, and flex item 3. However, we can put inside the flex container, dflex, the class names, what order we want them to appear in. So order-3 would cause flex item 1 to render in the third position. Order-1 would tell the flex item to render in the first position. And here, this is just telling to render in the position that it currently stays at. And then we can also assign auto margins. And so auto margins will push items to the right or push items to the left. So for instance, here we declare an auto margin after the first item here to go to the right. So we input the first item, and then all items thereafter are pushed to the rightmost. Or very similar, we can have auto margins that push everything to the left that come before it. We have the ability in our Flexbox to tell it whether it should wrap or not wrap. Its default behavior is to not wrap the content. So everything that's put into the Flex is either all unilaterally or linearly displayed horizontally or vertically. If you go ahead and define wrap, it will wrap based off of your viewport or the parent size. So an example of wrap turned on would look like this. This is an example of no wrap. Or you can even reverse the wrap, where it would wrap. If you notice what's happening with the reverse, we have items 1 through 7. They're at the bottom, right? Items 8 through 13, they're down here now. Items 14 through 19 are now up here. And then the last row becomes the first row if you do it in reverse order. Okay, and so we, in the CSS lab, should show you how we can use Flexbox to align content into the Flexbox. This is very powerful to be able to vertically and horizontally align our HTML elements. All the same alignment properties we have in CSS are defined exactly with the same terms, but with the class names in Bootstrap. So you have access to align content start, align content end, align content center, between, around, and stretch. And so just to show you what this looks like, I don't want to spend a lot of time re-explaining this, but align content start aligns all of the Flex items like this inside of the parent container, where end would bring it towards the very bottom. Center would center everything vertically to be in the center of your container. Align content around will kind of equally spread out all of your collection of Flex items in the Flex container, or stretch will stretch everything to fill the entirety of the space. We can also align items. So notice before, this was all items. This was the collection of Flex items that we can go ahead and redefine. We can also align individual items, so the entire one grouping of Flex items. So we have Flex items 1 through 3 at the start, or the collection of items at the end, or the collection of items at the center, or the baseline, and stretch. And then we can also just align self, which allows us to align an individual item. So we can have an individual item align itself next to its neighboring items to be at the start, to be at the end, to be at center, to be at the baseline, or to be stretched as well. So again, one of the powerful things about flex items is it gives you a granularity of how to vertically and horizontally align an individual flex item, a group of flex items, or like flex items of flex items, like groups of flex items. And really, the best way to get a better feel of how you'll use that is just through practice, honestly. So beyond having powerful controls to the CSS Flexbox through this vast collection of class names and being able to have a very simple way of applying a grid view to your HTML document, again, just using class names without having to define any of your own CSS, Bootstrap also has defined some really powerful components that are very common in developing web applications. One of the most popular of which is the Nav Bar. So you might want to think of a basic Nav Bar as the thing that appears at the top of a website that usually allows you to toggle between different parts of it. Like say, for instance, if you were to build a portfolio page, you might want to have a Nav Bar that appears on all your pages that allows you to toggle between your blog post, your projects, your About Us section, your contact page, and maybe your landing page. And so here's an example of a nav bar that would have a logo and the individual links. And nav bars can either be normally at the top, and as you scroll, you lose a nav bar, or you can kind of make it sticky so that it always stays at the top of the browser, regardless of how you scroll up or down inside the web page. And all these different functionalities are supported inside of Bootstrap. The basic idea of how we would define a nav bar is you just create a nav element inside of your HTML and then give it the class name nav bar. And then you can give it different properties. Like if you wanted it to have a light background, you can apply background colors just like you would for any other element. If you wanted it to be small or large, you can affect the size as well. The big thing is that you give it this nav bar class name. And then contained inside the nav HTML element, you would create some unordered group of list items that will represent your collection of links. And here, this might be navbar-nav to represent the navigation component of your navbar. And this unordered list would contain list items that include your nav items as their names, and then inside of there would be your actual anchor tags, which would be your nav links. So to build this nav bar would require that collection of class selectors. Your anchor tags, the things that hyperlink between your various pages, would be your nav links. The list items that contain the anchor links would be your nav items, and then the navbar nav would be the actual list itself. And that's all contained inside of a navbar container. Now, one of the more powerful features, and the reason why we're going to want to import the JavaScript component of Bootstrap into our projects, is that we're going to want to have the ability to have a collapsible navbar, because that's usually very common for mobile experiences. So what a collapsible navbar essentially is if the site is too small to properly display your links horizontally, you can create this hamburger icon. And when you push this hamburger icon, it'll roll out your collection of links. And so in order to have that kind of anything that you start requiring user input and dynamically updates the site requires JavaScript. I mean, that's the entire point of having JavaScript embedded into HTML page, is to be able to have that have logic that reorders and redraws things to the screen. So to be able to collapse and reorient our menu like this, we'll go ahead and use the JS component. And so here, I don't want to get into too much detail on how the collapsible navbars work and slides, because that's going to be covered in the lab. So you'll actually be implementing a collapsible navbar in Lab 3. Another big data container or component that is really nice in Bootstrap is the Bootstrap Cards. And so the basic structure of a card is that typically a card has a header, a card has a body, and a card has a footer. And then the body, the header, the footer, they can all include a card title and a card text. And so the way that a card renders is exactly like this. The way a card would get coded in our HTML would look like this. So we would create a div tag that will contain all the information for a card, and we would call that by class card. And then for each part of the card, now all these parts are optional. Cards don't, not all cards necessarily have to have a header or a body or a footer, but just to explicitly show that these are all options available to you, we can have a inner div that represents the data for the card header, an inner div that represents the data for the card body, an inner div that represents the data for a card footer, and we name them appropriately, right? Card-header, card-body, card-footer. And then let's say that the header is going to have that image. Then we can even label that image as the card-img-top. We're not forced to, though. We can also use img-thumbnail, or we do image.responsive-fluid. Inside the card body, if we wanted to have a title, then we could use the class name card-title, same with card-text, and this will all be used to render and appropriately display within the card. And then notice here, I could just put a paragraph here, or I could go ahead and the card-text doesn't just have to happen in the body. Actually, I should also do this too. If I'm going to have footer text, I should label that as card-text inside my footer as well. Okay, so one great thing about cards is typically you want to use cards when you're going to have more than one. And so you can take a collection of card components and group them into a div that's called a card group. And one of the powerful things about a card group is that it will actually orient all the cards horizontally, provided it has the viewport space. And if it doesn't have the viewport space, it'll collapse your card data so it's then displayed vertically. So here's an example of a collection of cards that are just cards. They don't have headers. They don't necessarily have bodies. They were just card tags, divs. I want to say they were just divs. Did I give them bodies? Yeah, I did give them bodies at least. That have different backgrounds. And here I stretched out my browser window so I could display them as such. And then I shrunk it so I could take a screenshot so you can see how it would then display vertically here. So notice with the margins, usually there's no margins between your card when they're left to right. It only creates some kind of margin when it's vertically laid out like that. So the way that this would kind of be implemented is this is my first card, right? I have my card, background blue. I gave it a body and I put some text in there. Then I have this one. Here's a card. It's got a background of yellow. That's warning. It's got a body with some text in there. Here I have a card with backgrounds of green. Success is green. It's got a body, centering the text in the body. And let's go back over here. Yep, all the text is centered. Okay. And then finally, I have here card with a background of red, danger. So these are four different cards that these are four different cards. So then I have a div class to contain those four cards. I then give that a class name of card group. And now it'll go ahead and with a responsive web design, determine how it should render those cards, whether it should render them horizontally, vertically, or a collection of the two, maybe two of them horizontally and 2 rows. Okay. I guess the last thing I just want to cover that's also a really great, powerful feature, among many, there's many more features that even the PowerPoint slides, despite being like 94 slides long, will not cover. And yeah, like for those like external things, you can always look at the source documentation on Bootstrap, or you can check up this cheat sheet that I had linked. But one of the other things that'll be part of the lab, at least, is to construct a carousel. All a carousel is it's like a slideshow of cycling elements, usually of picture elements. Sometimes you can go ahead and place captions on top. It has controls where you can click left or right to be able to control. Well, you have the option to have controls. You can just have it slide on its own, or you can go ahead and give the user controls where they can select left or right. And it usually also shows here some kind of thumbnail indexer to show what item or element number you're on within the carousel. But again, if your carousel is very large, you don't have to put this. You might have too many elements that it would not look nice to display that. So depending on the aesthetic you're looking for, these elements can be added or not on the carousel. And again, I don't want to get into the implementation of a carousel because it's a little bit more complicated, just like the collapsible Navbar. So really the big takeaway is just understanding what a carousel is, just like understanding what a collapsible Navbar is. And then you'll actually get a chance to experience these things when you go to construct them in the lab. Okay, so with that said, we very quickly ran through all of the major components of Bootstrap, likely that you would use about 95% of the time. And so it's a lot of content, but again, it's just class names. So there's not a difficulty in learning this. It'd be as difficult as like picking up a dictionary of English terms and trying to memorize that or use that. So it's a lot, but it's a lot of stuff that we kind of already covered, but it's available to us through a set of class names as opposed to having to hard code CSS to do all this stuff. But again, the big advantage of Bootstrap is how it will allow you to very quickly and rapidly prototype responsive websites. So with that said, you can expect that coming to Moodle very soon is going to be Lab 3, which is going to be a basic portfolio profile written in Bootstrap. And then you can anticipate what Homework 3 is already going to be. Homework 3 is going to be where you're going to have to design your own portfolio page. So you'll have essentially a very basic page we're going to design in the lab, and then you'll have to take all these various elements we talked about and create a custom and unique portfolio that really reflects you as an individual, and it will be a very different kind of, like, something you would be proud to be able to share with others to depict who you are as a developer, that would host your projects and that will host like articles you might write to illustrate your strong capabilities of communicating about technology. So I anticipate getting both the lab and the homework documents onto Moodle by the end of Friday. So so you should have access to it by the time the homework 1 and lab 2 are technically due. So I just have to finish writing up the document for the lab, and once I'm done that, then I'll write up the short document for homework 3. Now, with that said, I do have the official document for homework 2 posted on Moodle, so that is now available to you. Now, with that said, is there any questions about this before we close out for a full week? Or does anyone seem pretty good? So, okay, so that's a great question. So homework 2's requested that you style your interactive story. If you decide to style your interactive story using Bootstrap, I have no qualms with that. What I care about, if you look at the goal for homework 2 on my documentation, it's to produce a styling of your interactive story that is attractive, that looks professional, that you would be proud to use as a showcase piece to illustrate that you are a professional, a proficient designer, that you can use the stylings and create something that is aesthetically pleasing, that you kind of understand the general guidelines of not using too many fonts, unless it makes sense to use too many fonts, not using too many colors, unless it makes sense to use two different. It's all right to break the rules as long as there's a rationale behind it. But the idea is that you want to create something that doesn't look amateur, so to speak. And so if you want to do that with Bootstrap, Bootstrap's great because a lot of those design choices have been selected for you. The reason why there's only like 8 colors available is a design choice because they didn't want to have users having access to so many colors. So yeah, I have no qualms with you using Bootstrap to complete homework 2 if that's what you opt to do. So yeah, so homework 2 and lab 3 are due next Friday. That's correct. So when I release lab 3 on Friday, you can anticipate it having a due date on Friday. Yes. I mean lab 3, yeah, lab 3. And then yeah, homework 2. Yep, they're both due same day. Yeah, thank you. Everyone have a great Mardi Gras. Have a great weekend. If you have any questions while working on this, feel free to hit me up on Discord. Again, I know this was a lot of content. I'm hoping since this is all recorded, you'll be able to go back and listen to portions that might have, since it was an information dump, be able to isolate parts as you need it, or just refer to this document. Or check the links that I have provided inside of this document for even more expressive amounts of explanations on how to use this. But really, Bootstrap's pretty simple. Once you go ahead and include it, then you just have to use the labels, the class names, and you get really nice styling. Okay, well, let's see here. Let me stop the recording. If there's no other questions, I'm going to stop the recording and I'll end lecture for today. Okay.
I have a question real quick.
Oh, sure. What's that?
So the homework is due tomorrow, so we turn it in on the Moodle link. But
that's right. So the process is you'll turn the homework in on the Moodle link, and then eventually, or as soon as you can, you want to go into Discord, go into the request audit section, and request an audit time, where essentially we'll have a one-on-one video conference where you'll share your screen. So when we do that, make sure you're on a laptop or a computer, and you'll be able to demo your application for me. So for this instance, it'll be relatively easy because it's just going to be the HTML itself. It doesn't even need to have styling. But if you have styling, that would be nice. But the styling isn't even due until next week. So essentially, you would demo it out, and then we talk about the source code and the elements and some of your design choices and things like that. But I'll be able to give you immediate feedback, person-to-person feedback, right through that conference call. And so after that, I'll go ahead and give you your actual grade on Moodle so that it'll go into your grade book. So that's a big important thing to understand when you turn in a homework is you won't necessarily get the homework grade by turning it into Moodle. You have to turn it to Moodle for me to be able to assign a grade to it. So it always has to be submitted to Moodle, but I won't give you a grade until after we complete an audit. And the way that you initialize the audit is to go into this request audit channel on our Discord server and request a time that is not one of the unavailable times that I have listed here, and is not one of the times that's already taken by someone else. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, audits are mandatory. You will not get, even if you finish your assignment and turn it in, it will not get a grade until it's been audited, because audits are my mechanism to give you my feedback on your projects, which is one of the critical parts about having you do these projects, is so that you, first of all, have the ability to talk about what you completed, talk about what obstacles you overcame, talked about what techniques you use to actually accomplish your code base, but also to go ahead and for me to tell you what I think you did a great job on and where you could have improved on. So yes, we're going to do, so audits are required for every homework. And so for the first homework, it's likely going to be very short. I can't imagine it takes longer than, I've already done one for the first homework. You can anticipate about a 10-minute, maybe a 15-minute audit, if even that long, because we're just running through your HTML interactive story and selecting options and checking out what kind of content you added there. Now, I will say the audits could progressively get more complex as we start adding additional technologies into our stack. But for the first several audits, you can anticipate something relatively short. I just want to get everyone into the process of going through this audit process, which is very similar to how you would check in with your project manager if you were employed. Okay, so we're doing, okay, so did I answer everyone's questions then? Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. If you have any other questions, then please just message me on Discord.